going to be with me in a moment co-hosting this Twitter space. And we are going to be discussing developments in Zimbabwe. And this includes the performance of the economy there, the hardships that people seem to be going through at the moment, as well as the forthcoming elections in Zimbabwe, the political dynamics there. But on top of that, we will be discussing the implications for South Africa and whether there are any lessons for South African politics. We'll be taking your comments and sharing them with the rest of the audiences. So please feel free to raise whatever issues you'd like to raise with us so that we can have a constructive discussion on matters that affect Zimbabwe and indirectly and definitely directly affecting South Africa. It's time to be constructive, and it's time to get South Africans, Zimbabweans, to talk together around the table and figure out what we're going to do in Zimbabwe, what should happen in Zimbabwe, but more importantly, what should also happen in the SADC region. So I am waiting to have Hopewell Chinono join me to be with us on this Twitter Spaces. And I also appreciate that many of you have indicated an interest in this discussion. So I hope that we will learn from one another. What do the people want? What do the people expect? And how do we want to go about dealing with matters of common concern? And that's the whole point of this Twitter space that we are having with you this afternoon, evening. So I will be welcoming my friend and colleague, Hopewell Chinono. Good afternoon, my brother. Welcome.
Thank you very much, my brother Timothy. It's a great pleasure to co-host this Twitter Spaces with you. Your reputation precedes you, so it's quite an honor to be here.
No, I'm quite chuffed, and I'm also impressed, please, with the fact that you agreed to be with me on this Twitter space, and we're going to learn a lot from you. You've put yourself on the line many a times in favor of your people, Zimbabwean people, shining the light in the dark corners so we could learn more about the dynamics in your country. And here we are, a few months away from Zimbabwean elections. But now, let me start right away by asking, what is going on currently in Zimbabwe, economically speaking? I saw you posting something about inflation being at more than 2,000% at this time. What's happening?
Well, the economy collapsed as expected because of the bad economic policy policies that were put in place. And as we all know, the corruption, the looting of public funds, the plunder of the country's natural resources, and the failure by government to do what needed to be done. So now we have a situation where, according to Professor Hank, who has been measuring Zimbabwe's inflation for the past 10 years, we are now in hyperinflation. The rates, I'm just told today, went up again, the official rate, to about 5,700 Zimbabwean dollars against the US dollar. Our hospitals, as I've always said, my brother, do not have medication. The whole country, the whole country's public health system does not have a single radiotherapy machine. 2,500 women die every year giving birth, which means that we do not have maternity theaters that are supposed to create a safe space for women who are giving birth. And to make matters worse, there's no dialogue happening amongst the political actors that could help resolve the this issue, whether it's the government to opposition or government talking to change, is not happening at the moment. And it's important for Zimbabweans to understand that a solution has to be broad-based. It has to involve everyone and not just be a special deal for a particular group of people, because as we saw with the GNU, the problems will come back to haunt us again. As we saw with the coup, the problems will come back to haunt us again.
Hello.
Are you there, my brother?
Hello. Yes, I'm here. Sorry, my mic was switched off for a moment. I'm saying, the on the ground impact of all of this is the fact that it has led to a lot of Zimbabweans having to emigrate to other countries around the world, and definitely coming to South Africa by large numbers, and some of them coming to South Africa illegally, which in itself has led to some tensions in different communities in South Africa, which I'm sure you're aware of. They've been widely reported. So these are the hardships that the Zimbabweans face, and now it leads to other problems for them, having to leave their homes to seek incomes and economic well-being, as well as social benefits that you've referred to. But then South Africans, many of them, regard that as competition for them, leading to conflicts between ordinary folk.
Yes, that's very true. 75% of women that give birth at Msina Hospital are coming from Zimbabwe. And this has been caused by the breakdown of the health delivery system in Zimbabwe. And I'm glad to say that today we've got Clayton Monyela, who's the head of public diplomacy in the South African government. He's going to speak to us about the position of the South African government vis-a-vis Zimbabwe. And we're going to have Xavier Kasukuwere, who was in President Robert Mugabe's government and is now running as a presidential candidate. I'm sure there will be a lot of interesting stuff coming from him. And we have Brian Kagoro. Brian Kagoro is better placed to give us an overview of what's happening. And because I know he looks at things historical as well, he was part of the group that formed what we became the MDC. He was also part of the National Constitutional Assembly, NCA, and he was part of the student movement at the University of Zimbabwe. So he is seen it all from the 90s up to today. So good afternoon, Brian, and welcome to this Twitter space. The floor is yours.
Thank you both. I think in thinking through this, I think that it's best to say that the activist who suggested that Zimbabwe is the trailer and South Africa is the movie in the 80s couldn't have been more accurate. The implications for South Africa are much more fundamental than the flow of warm bodies across the border in order to seek greener pastures. South Africa, as we speak, has had a standoff with the Americans that has led the Americans to take a position or to start processes of taking a position towards its entitlement tariff waivers under the AGOA Treaty. And South Africa's economy is not in the most splendid of health, given the spectacular challenges with the energy crisis. Or ESCOM, and second, I think South Africa itself may, if it is not entering into some form of deflation, it certainly has entered a stage of stagnation. So the South African economy depends on its regional neighbors and the international conduits. If its regional neighbors, such as Zimbabwe, which is not a small trading partner, coughs or enters into greater instability than what Hopewell you have described, South Africa's economy is going to suffer from the domino effects. So even if no single Zimbabwean moved across the border, I think that it is in the interest of South Africa that the neighborhood not only be stable, and I'm talking about a neighborhood where we have Mozambique, which has experienced over the last couple of years significant strain arising out of the violent extremism in the north. We have Zambia, which is trying to recover from a long period, as you know, of significant difficulties. And then, of course, we have Botswana and etc. So South Africa is sitting in a neighborhood that's beset by significant economic challenges. But if you think about Zimbabwe specifically, Tim and Hopewell, the fundamental challenge is one of constitutionalism, that the political elite arose or rose into power impelled by the logic of one party state rule and has never quite adjusted to the notion of anyone within the polity having a right to compete against them. And so the response to any opposition has always been acerbic, even opposition that had its history in the nationalist movement. And we saw in Zimbabwe the response to Joshua Nkomo and etc. But the second is that this, you could say, related to competition for political power. But there are three strands that are related to personalization of power. And in Zimbabwe, this occurred in 1987 as a result of the amendment number 7 to the constitution and the move towards an imperial presidency. And that imperial presidency was not fully cured by the 2013 constitution. So this idea of concentration of power in the person or office of the president, this second was the historical marriage of political power, incumbency, and violence, or the use of violence within our politics in order to forge consent and consensus. South Africa itself, notwithstanding its great constitution, has suffered since 1994 to episodic resort to violence in order to settle questions of political difference. And this has tended to happen as black on black violence. And the third, if you look at this personalization of power, the use of violence, is this conflation of the party, the state, the economy, and the securocracy. At the end of the day, what you essentially see is a security elite that's inseparable from the political party, ruling party, that's inseparable from the economic shenanigans of the political elite, and into this add the administrative elite. So there's an abiding interest or confluence of interest between those who ought to be impartial civil servants, those who ought to be professional soldiers and police officers protecting the rights and interests of the citizens, and those who ought to be, if you like, defending the security of the country. And the ideological or weaponization of false ideological epithets, whether it's Pan-Africanism, some form of left-wing pretensions, are startling in the sense that we have a largely neoliberal political elite, or a political elite that's adopted neoliberal economic policies that have impoverished workers, impoverished the poor, who, when it suits them in order to defend their position in power, they will adopt a posture of anti-imperialism, anti-colonialism. But it's also a political elite that's been endemically addicted to secret affairs or relationships with white business elites. And during the day, it condemns anybody who is seen talking to any person who is white. It's also an elite, ultimately, which has run national policy and international relations in order to serve largely the interest of the global North. And its relationship with the East has tended to be a relationship of convenience when it falls out of favor as a result of its kleptocratic tendencies or simply its shoddy human rights records. It tends to the East, not in order to bolster historical ideological alliances in order to empower workers, peasants, and the unemployed, but simply to preserve the interest of a highly entrenched kleptocratic and oftentimes, if you like, tribalistic national elite. That said, the problem of constitutionalism is that convoluted. Zimbabwe has, within its constitutional architecture and its legal architecture, enough to deal with this. So, for example, you know that Section 67 of the Constitution has rights and responsibilities of political parties, which are clear: free and fair and regular elections, that adults have the right to vote, the right to stand for and hold public office, the right to form and belong to political parties of their choice. Political parties, candidates have the right to campaign peacefully and the right to have access to the media. What we see is a deprivation of all these rights and more. And as a result, the real dangers as we approach this election are that the question, fundamental question of the independence and the impartiality of the Zimbabwe Electoral Commission remains unresolved. The heavily biased approach of the state media, which seems to favor the ruling party, incidents of voter suppression and intimidation, including lengthy pre-trial detention of journalists, of political opponents, and etc., as well as extra-constitutional, illicit, and potentially unlawful influence of traditional chiefs, who, as we have seen in videos, are expected to bring people to line up behind them, and the disenfranchisement of diaspora voters, Zimbabwean diasporas who are asked to contribute to economic recovery, asked to contribute to the social well-being and welfare of impoverished relatives, the inaccessibility and shambolic state of the voters' roll, and the politicization of basic needs of social service provisioning, and we've seen this with food and other things. And I think fundamentally, as I already said, the securitization and militarization of electoral institutions and processes, including the police, all sides equally, engaging in politicized arrests, inequitable. They will hear one side threaten violence, do nothing, and when the other side remotely says anything that's close to threatening violence, they'll act with such swiftness that you will not believe it's the same police. We have fundamental problems historically with vote counting, verification, and the declaration of results process. And the disputes over the last 4 elections have pertained to this. And of course, we've had fundamentally the problem with the transfer of power. We've had the current incumbent boast about how election lost in 2008, Mugabe was ready to hand over, but the military or some other such people dissuaded him from so doing. This therefore means, Hopewell team, we consistently recycle eminently failed political elites, right? And we do so in a... Yeah.
Sorry to interrupt you. I mean, you raised several points here, and they're very instructive, most of what you said. But is there a role that South Africa, through its government, should have played and can play now to make sure that to some extent you have reasonably free and fair elections in Zimbabwe?
Yes, it's clear that South Africa, as a trusted neighbor, can insist in the application of the African Union norms and standards for free and fair elections, including the recently promulgated Malabo Protocol, which creates a crime for unconstitutional change of government, and this includes tinkering with laws so that you disadvantage your opponents, changing factors that make the playing field uneven. I think South Africa could play, without having to resort to megaphone diplomacy, could play both behind the scenes a very assertive role in ensuring that we do not have a predictable trudging on to an election that's not only shambolic. The access to the voters' roll. This is not a matter of sanctions or white interest or anything. It is expected in any decent election, and South Africa could urge its counterparts in Harare to make the voters' roll available in electronic form to competitors in this election. Sure. So voters' roll, the independence of the Electoral Management Board, yeah.
Let me ask you another question, and then hopefully you'll come in here. And I would also like Xavier to share with us some of his views, and we'll bring in Clayson Manyela later on to comment. But to ordinary South Africans, Brian, people wonder why Zimbabweans, ordinary folk, are not taking matters into their own hands to deal with what is developing there. Not that things are better here in South Africa, but I suppose the history of the mass democratic movement, the masses of people going on protest action all over the place and putting pressure on the government. And now and again, when people are not happy here in South Africa, they do march to the union buildings and they use the press to ventilate their concerns. So it's an ongoing type of engagement here in South Africa. It's not the best there is, but it's there. So people feel like they can do something about their situation one way or another. Why is that not possible in Zimbabwe?
Yeah, I like that question, Tim. You know, idealism grows with one's distance from a problem. While South Africa went through a struggle for its liberation, South Africa cannot say, like Zimbabwe, that there was a live war fought on its soil for 15 years that did there Zimbabwe. And that war was not fought by aliens, it was fought by Zimbabwe. So if you are talking about a history of fighting against oppression, and then of course there's Gukurahundi, which we talk about as though it's something that happened. It happened and there were protests, there was resistance. Between 2000 and the present day, we have had more than 3,000 Zimbabweans die at the hands of the state in instances where it's targeted violence, torture, and etc. Have there been demonstrations? Yes. We hear more about the South African demonstrations because your media is freer. In Zimbabwe, in South Africa, your military does not get involved in domestic protests. And the one time you had a militarized response, which was Marikana, that led to the death of so many people, your judicial institutions, your parliament, even including members of the ruling ANC, responded to that on the basis of values. What we have as a corridor is that Hopewell was detained, so-and-so is detained, protests, then you have people killed. Should Zimbabweans do more? Yes, they could and should do more. But the conditions and the response of various state institutions, including security institutions in South Africa and Zimbabwe, are totally different. The greatest danger here is that people will fire rubber bullets at you, they'll fire tear gas and water cannons. In Zimbabwe, the likelihood is live fire. And that's what we saw on August 2. By the way, August 2, 2018, were people protesting, and people often forget that it's not that they have not seen Zimbabweans protesting. They have, and when Zimbabweans die, of course, we had this Motlanthe Commission. The Motlanthe Commission then indicated that there had been excessive use of force, but the region still doesn't take any decisive position to condemn mass murder. Whether or matters on the street of citizens lawfully exercising their rights. So it's not that it doesn't happen, it does happen. Could more happen? Yes, more could happen, but the result would be the same because the region always protects its own.
Right, Hopewell, let me bring you in here. What would you like to say, I mean, in addition to what Brian has told us? And after you speak, let's invite Xavier to also share his thoughts with us.
Yeah, I mean, what Brian gave us is an important understanding of the situation in Zimbabwe with a bit of history, because most of the times people speak about the now and they forget about how we got to this situation. So, Bratim, I think I will ask Brian a few questions. I've got a few questions for him. So, Brian, if I were a South African today, why should I be worried about a contested result in Zimbabwe after August 2023? And what would that contested result look like in terms of action, the implication for a South African sitting in Johannesburg or sitting in Polokwane?
Yeah, number one, I think that be worried first and foremost because you are an African and you care about your fellow brothers and sisters. But be worried, number two, because political elites across the world have been copying the worst practices from each other. And that's across East, West, South. Number three, there is no fence, there's no military, there's nothing that will stop an influx of a people who are fleeing from hunger and from violence. And so if you thought you had a problem and you will not have enough tires and fire to burn your own brethren, you will become a criminal trying to burn people that you could help without having to necklace.
And in terms of dialogue, what a lot of people have been talking about dialogue, whether it's you go to East Africa or you go to North Africa, West Africa, they're all saying, why isn't there dialogue? What sort of dialogue do you think needs to happen in order for this 23-year-old, so to speak, problem to go away?
The problem is 100 years old. The reason why Ian Smith lasted for so long is that there were talks, there was no dialogue. Ian Smith viewed the idea of dialogue as him dictating to our fathers and mothers who were liberation fighters his terms, and as opposed to listening to the cries and the demands of the majority, and hence the armed struggle. We have that ghost of Rhodesia has been with us, Joshua Nkomo Mugabe, for a long time. There was no dialogue, there were talks, but there was no willingness to listen to and fully and responsibly accommodate. Tsvangirai Mugabe, now we are with Mnangagwa Chamisa. The dialogue is not about the political elite. The political elite are the problems that dramatize the need for dialogue. The dialogue is between the entire leadership of society, business, civic, political, and society, to map a direction for the reconstruction of a country that has been significantly and consistently destroyed, little inch by inch, by different political leaders, and by the lack of a collective vision and consent and consensus on what needs to be done. But dialogue doesn't happen because those who wield power and those who want power don't willingly go and talk about the general welfare of the general mass. So if you don't have strong external interlocutors and strong demand internally from the citizens themselves, you will have this abiding Zimbabwean problem that everybody thinks they will win this in some decisive battle, whether that battle is through the ballot or through the bullet. And we saw this. That's why I said we've had it since the inception of the Rhodesian state. The inability to read through how we balance political interests with objective, broader national interests, including economic and social.
Well, Brian, let me come in here. I want to pose a question to you. There are some South Africans who think that the economic problems in Zimbabwe are as a result of sanctions that were imposed on the government there, but otherwise the policies, some of them at least, are sound enough and should work in the long term, the expropriation of land being one example. There are people who believe that to some extent Zimbabwe has got something to teach South Africa when it comes to managing its economy, even though at this time we are facing our own challenges with the high unemployment rate, high poverty levels, high inequality, and of course the social fabric of our society, beginning to come apart now as a result of these economic pressures. What is your comment about that, about those who...
Jim, let's start off with a simple matter. I'm one of those Zimbabweans who've consistently said Western sanctions, whether they are targeted, whether they actually are the cause of the economic challenge or not, must be removed. The idea that one sovereign can, through its domestic legislative authority, constrain the international relations of another sovereign is unacceptable to me as Brian. I know in this I differ with a lot of my colleagues, and my position on this has been consistent. And a lack of respect for basic history. When labor movements went into strike mode in 1989, there were no sanctions. When students and labor went into strike action from 1989 to 1995, there were no sanctions. The economy was in structural crisis. Part of that structural crisis is hereditary, and part of it was the wholesale acceptance by Mugabe of the World Bank, IMF economic structural adjustment programs that created massive redundancies in the economy, and that created, if you like, industrial levels of informalization. This informalization and redundancies affected black workers who only had been brought into formal employment and public sector employment at the point of independence. So for the majority black population, the former white-owned businesses employed them at the most menial and low levels. The state, which was giving them opportunities, began to get rid of them as a result of structural adjustment programs. In 1997, we made the decision to go into the DRC. You and I can debate whether that decision to go into the DRC was a correct one. Simba Makone, in his budget speech as Minister of Finance in 2000, and this you can find on the internet, he indicated that Zimbabwe was spending from its own budget $1 million per day. That's a conservative estimate. During that same period in 1997, we gave war veterans or veterans of the war that we had neglected for many years 2.5 billion extra budget allocation that we had not budgeted for. It was a budgetary appropriation. The economy went into tailspin, not because of sanctions. Zidera had not yet come into being. So Black Thursday actually happened, which is where the Zimbabwean currency lost more than 45% of its value in less than 6 hours. Happened before Zidera. Zidera comes into being in 2000, the Zimbabwe Democracy and Economic Something Act, the so-called sanctions bill. If you want to critique part of the genesis of the problem, you have to look at those factors so that you are not pretending every problem began with sanctions. Sanctions worsened what was already dramatically a problem. We were having fuel challenges at the time. We had food shortages at the time. We had actually resorted to the conflict that had arisen between the industrial class and the state. And then let me go back to the question of indigenization. There used to be an indigenization policy. When Mnangagwa came into power, whether or not you agreed with that indigenization policy, it was reversed. There used to be the land. We're compensating white commercial farmers. Between you and I, Tim, a lot of those farmers had borrowed heavily from the local financial services sector. When the farms were expropriated, there was no serious cataloging or documentation of how much each farmer owed. The compensation, the taking of the farms essentially meant that the farmers were able to exit their, if you like, their legal obligations or of the loans that they owed to local banks, because the act of state was enough for them to say they were unable to meet their obligations, not because they were irresponsible, but because an intervening factor, which is the state policy, had made them unable to. So whether or not that money that was borrowed was effectively and wholly used on the farms or banked somewhere, no one knows. There was no compensation of black farm workers. Let me just finish. There were 500,000 black farm workers, according to the GAPU's General Plantation Workers Union, on the farms. Nobody has talked about compensating them. These people, most of them were evicted from the farms as the veterans took over the farms. They went onto the streets to suggest that 500,000 people plus their family, that's a population of almost 1.6 million people, just disappeared. We must produce poverty, intentionally or unintentionally, through several actions that could have been better thought through, and we are doing worse now. When Mugabe left with $6 billion of debt, it's barely 6 years after Mugabe's departure, we're sitting in double digits of debt. How do we explain? And most of the borrowings are not building anything of significance. They are not creating jobs. They are not creating value. Hopewell has already given us a sense of how the social services sector have not been replenished. Nothing as new has been built. So we are borrowing in order to finance conspicuous consumption and recurrent expenditure. This is part of the problem. And kleptocracy and corruption. Look, as a person who is opposed to sanctions, I cannot sit and allow people who are willingly destroying the economy and the of Zimbabweans, born and unborn, putting all of us in debt, to excuse their grand theft and investments in the Middle East, in Europe and elsewhere as purely the product of sanctions. Sanctions do not create thieves. Thieves create sanctions.
Thanks very much, Brian. Well, very, very incisive and forthright. Appreciate that. Hopewell, I'm bringing you back in.
Thank you, my brother. A lot of these problems were authored under the watch of President Robert Mugabe, and they continue to be authored today under the watch of President Emmerson Mnangagwa. And for the past 43 years, it was ZANU-PF that has been in power. And so it's I think, appropriate today that we have Xavier Kasukuwere, who was the indigenization minister, local government minister, and youth minister at some point, to give us his overview about the problems that are happening in Zimbabwe and how they relate to South Africa and why South Africans should be worried about a disputed election result in August. And very interestingly, Xavier is going to be participating in this election as a presidential candidate. Go ahead, Xavier Sugwele.
Thank you very much, colleagues. Thank you very much, those who have joined us on Space. I think this has been a very, very interesting opportunity for us to introspect, to look at Zimbabwe's history, the challenges that we are facing and we continue to face, and how they impact on South Africa, as well as whether South Africa can draw lessons from the things that we've done. I want to say first and foremostly that it's politics. We've got to get our politics right. All the challenges that we're discussing this afternoon, and thanks to Brian for this brilliant presentation, stem from a skewed political structure that in the main is not about serving the majority of the people, but aimed at enhancing or benefiting the interests of a clique, a small clique. I'll use an example. Just a few months ago, ministers were able to be allocated, or they got $500,000 each, housing allowance, members of parliament 40,000, senior government officials some money. Where on earth do you see leadership allocating itself public funds? These funds can be obtained in institutions. Individuals can go and borrow in the building society. This is the kind of political class that I think has created a serious problem for us. Secondly, we also have this chaotic posture of how politics must be run. We think the more muscle we have, how much we can be able to suppress those who don't agree with us, is a way or a panacea to call it finding a solution to our problems. And thirdly, there is a post-independence paralysis. After independence, the liberation struggle, it has been difficult for the political class to come up with an architecture that says, where do we go from here? What is the next level of our struggle? What is it that we must do? Clearly, it's an economic issue, and it's about how our people are going to be uplifted out of poverty. It appears today that we are still stuck in the politics of 1980. We are still stuck in the politics of yesteryear. In South Africa, take note. It is not politicians alone who have a duty to resolve these questions, but it is now the majority of the people each time they go to elections to be able to elect competent leaders who are prepared to put the nation ahead of self. As we go to these elections in Zimbabwe on the 23rd of August, what comes to my mind, and I have been inside, I have been outside, one would say I've had the Damascene moment. I have seen it, I participated in it, I know it, and I've also looked and introspected. 4 or 5 things. We've got to reset our nation back to basics. We've got to go back to the basics as a people of Zimbabwe and say, who are we? What are we supposed to be doing? Let's set an agenda for our people that is all-encompassing, an all-inclusive strategy that ensures that each and every Zimbabwean has a role to play and there's a feeling, a sense of responsibility that this is my country. As it stands, many of Zimbabweans have either given up hope or some will say, oh, well, God might help us. But there is no God that will come and help us if we don't do something about this situation. Each time elections come, these are the moments and times that present themselves an opportunity for people's voices to be heard. I've been in politics for some time, and I can assure you, elections, whether one moves around very proudly and say nothing will happen to me, you can't trust the ballot. We need to be able to motivate our people to go and participate in the electoral process so that we can take back our country. The power must go back to the people. We must take this back to basics. The constitutionalism that Brian has spoken about. It's important that we have rule of law. People must know exactly what it means to be a citizen. Certain areas where you see blatant disregard of the law, that should be dealt with. Why would Job Scala spend 300 days in prison when someone who stole clearly money for the cotton farmers in Gokwe is left to go scot-free? He moves around, but you can tell where the resources meant for the farmers have gone to. But someone who was trying to put across his view is placed in prison. Secondly, we need to reconcile our people. I think Hopewell spoke earlier on about dialogue. It's not just about dialogue among the deaf, but it must be dialogue, serious dialogue that says, let us come together. We are one people. We are one nation. Whatever you do hurts the other guy next door. Lessons have been learned. We got it wrong in Matabeleland. We got it wrong in 2000. We got it wrong in 2008. We got it wrong in 2019, 2017. These are all areas and times that you see that the things that were done left so much hurt and pain in majority of instances to many people. Let's face the reality. Let's sit down as Zimbabweans, reconcile ourselves. Let's have a very clear diagnostic process that we will all say, never again. Secondly, in terms of that same area that I'm talking about, we have not dealt with the question of being able to say, I am sorry. Reconciliation requires that we be able to come forward and say, you know what, I made a mistake. As a leadership, we should not be able to hide our heads in the sand like an ostrich. Let us face up to the mistakes we make so that we can be able to bring all our people together. Their kids and daughters, their children today, some are old now in Matabeleland who have not been able to get birth certificates because of what happened there. A genuine reconciliation, a genuine process of reparations must be put in place. That will ensure that the years that they have lost, those who have gone through pain, can be recovered. And I believe it's essential that in each and everything that we do, it is not about revenge. It is not about fixing others. I believe that it is essential now for Zimbabweans to reconcile our differences. Sit down. Let's reduce the volume, I always say. Turn down the volume, reduce the volume, and concentrate on building a great nation. Let me come to my third point on the areas that I'm talking about. I'll just give you 5 of them. We have to reform our institutions. I mean, you see the chaos that's happening in the financial service sector. And you ask yourself, we have a central bank. This is not the first time we've gone through this kind of process or problems, where money works in the morning, you wake up, it's 1:10, and then it becomes 1:1,000, 100,000, and so forth. We have been through this road before in 2008. What is it that we continue to do wrong that lands us in the same type of problems? We now have an inflation that has gone even way beyond the Weimar Republic at its worst. What should we do as Zimbabweans? We believe we have economists, but we have also a government. How are we treating our printing press? Are we just continuing to churn out money? We are using money that we are not earning. What is the responsibility of those who are involved in those institutions? It goes back even to institutions that have to look at security, institutions of judiciary, and everything across the board. All our institutions must be institutions that serve the broader interests of our people. There are many who do not have power, but there are many who expect their government to look after them. Let it not be a law of those with muscle, and those who have no muscle have no defense whatsoever. Number 4.
Yeah, okay. I want to ask you a question when you get to point 5, right? I've got a question for you.
Yeah, we have to revive our economy. And like Bill Clinton would say, stupid is the economy. Is the economy stupid? We need all of us to put our hands on the deck and get our country out of this wall, what should we do? We have to stabilize our economy. We have to be predictable in terms of the investment climate. You can't be running a country on the basis of 200-300 statutory instruments every day. We need to be able to ensure that there is security of tenure for the farmers. We carried out the glorious land reform program, so to speak, but what has happened there is that there is even no security of tenure, even to a government minister, because the moment you are fired tomorrow, or someone feels you are no longer towing the line, the land is, you are threatened, it's taken away from you. This kind of, perpetuating a process that says you are going to blackmail you, I'll hold you to ransom if you disagree with me, should be done away with. If we have allocated resources to our people, if our people are on the farms, if our people have tenure, they should be able to go and obtain loans directly from institutions and do what they have to do. In so doing also, as we revive our economy, we've got to fight corruption, a big cancer in our society, where theft has now become part and parcel of how the economy is run. And clearly, colleagues, when you drive and you look around in our country, be it in the urban centers, you can tell that there's something extremely wrong. Now the supermarkets are no longer running. Things are on the streets. That is not the economy we're intended to have. You look across the world, you look across other regions, things are actually happening. What is it that we can do as Zimbabweans together to revive our industries? We used to be a giant, and we can be a giant. And lastly, I'll talk about the rebuilding.
That seems like a campaign speech.
Okay,
when you ask a presidential candidate to speak, I'm sure I'm not going to use this. I'm not going to miss an opportunity to because I'm saying we as Zimbabweans, finally we must rebuild our institutions. Hopewell talks about the health delivery institutions. Two things that are critical in the lives of people: their health institutions and the education of their children. Education must be once.
Ask you a question. My question is, you were in government yourself for some time, right? Where does this mindset come from within most African governments that they should work for themselves, for the individuals who are holding senior positions in government, that they look after themselves and their personal interests at the expense of other people, of the rest of their nations? Number two, given what you know from your personal experience in Zimbabwe, you're now presidential candidate, what do you see in South Africa that you would like to warn us about, to alert us to, that we may be getting ourselves into, and in the medium to long run is going to get us into trouble? We are in trouble already, but we would like to reverse that and improve things here.
Well, South Africa must cater for its people. You must have policies that bring the people into the economy. I shudder to think what can happen in this country in the future if you do not involve your people in the economy. I'm sure it will be too ghastly to contemplate. You must be clear that for people to remain loyal citizens, to remain people who are supporting their country, they must be involved in some way or the other. The number of young people I see in South Africa who have no hope is frightening. You need to enact policies and programs that ensure that you bring the majority on the mainstream of your economy. You can't just simply expect others to do it for you and your own people are not doing it for themselves. Look at your Johannesburg JSE. How many African billionaires or millionaires have you been able to build since after independence? In other words, how many Black South Africans are emerging in all fields of endeavor, in the medical sector, who is in the financial service sector, who is in the petroleum sector, who is in the mining space, who are the Dangotes of South Africa? Not as big as Dangote, but is there a gradual plan? Who are the African farmers we have? The land reform program. What are you doing? We have seen you enact policies and programs around it. And you have, there's been this tendency of moving 2 steps forward, 1 step forward and 2 steps backwards. And I think South Africa must remember, it is your people, if they are content, your people, if they are busy, that will build a better South Africa.
So,
now, the political class.
Here's the point, if I may just jump in here, that as much as we can talk about the wealthy people, the number of billionaires that are created, in the South African context, the blight on our society is the fact that 60% of young people below the age of 35 who are not at training institutions or at universities and so on, or receiving any education, are unemployed. 60% of them are unemployed, and they constitute a substantial portion of our country's population. I think that is a much more serious indictment on how we go about running things.
I agree with you. And also it's a question of what are we doing in terms of how many technicals do we have? It appears with a propensity of training Bachelor of Arts, Bachelor of Laws students. We are training people in sciences, political sciences, and so forth. I think South Africa must increase the number of technical colleges so that you have the psychomotor matching up with the intellectual angle, so that at least at the end of the day, both those who might not be gifted from an academic point of view, but are able to get the engines turning, get on with the job. How many boilermakers do we have? How many centers do we train boilermakers, engineers, and so forth? Look at the gap in terms of electricity that's already emerging. You can tell that there is a skills gap that is slowly but surely building. Yet, we're all in agreement that from 35 years and below, hundreds and thousands of these youngsters have no job, have no employment. Because are we training them to fit a certain kind of work, or we are just taking them through a mass production system that will not be able to produce anything? I believe one of the areas as we enter the fourth industrial revolution, we also need to train our people in this new sector. But please don't forget, we need the fitter antenna, we need the plumber. These are the things that our people live with. They interact with on a daily basis. You want to build a house, you want to build accommodation. Yeah. Where are the people?
I got that. And Hopewell, can you please take us forward?
Yes,
I'm bringing you back.
I wanted to say that, Seveka Sugwere, you have been in government for a very long time. And you were part of the Secret Service. You are a trained Secret Service agent. So you know much more than we do in regards to what was happening. You know the relationship between Zimbabwe and South Africa and the relationship between ZANU-PF and the ANC. What do you think can be done based on the knowledge that you have? What do you think that South Africa can do practically to try and influence things in Harare to happen the proper way? You heard Brian talk about the disaster, that it's not just about looking at Zimbabwe as something that has happened in that country, but as an African, all Africans should be concerned about what's happening in Zimbabwe. But based on your knowledge of being in government and working for Secret Service, what do you think the South African government can practically do to nudge Harare to do the right thing? To what extent do you think things can be practically done?
Well, first and foremost, even before I get to that element of peer review for leaders to be able to really look at and discuss, look at each eye for eyeball and say, guys, what is it that we're doing? I have a feeling that business in South Africa has actually been unfairly benefiting from the crisis in Zimbabwe. And this exploitation, I think there has to be some kind of discussion as well and say, are we doing the right thing? As they exploit resources in Zimbabwe, business itself has not given the politics, let alone given its voice to say, let's get things right. You have thousands of Zimbabweans crossing the Limpopo, meaning that they come and work here for almost a less the amount of that they could be getting, i.e., they work for a bottle of wine if they're going to work in the Cape wine industry. Whereas the South Africans will simply say, no, I need this kind of decent wage. But coming back to the politics, there was a time when our leaders would meet as SADC, as the frontline states, and you look forward to those discussions, and they were having this ability to correct each other, peer review. They were able to call to order a leader when he goes wrong. But this thing has really, unfortunately, come to a stop. The political parties, ZANU-PF as a party that fought for the liberation of our country, the African National Congress, MPLA in Angola, Frelimo in Mozambique, Chama Cha Mapinduzi in Tanzania, and so forth, were political parties that had a very clear ideological focus in terms of what should be done. I know for a fact, and I participated in some of the liberation movement meetings, that so to say, how do we place the revolution at the next level? But it appears diplomacy has taken more than what Clayson can be able to do, because diplomats are now able to push a lot of debt under the carpet. And I think the ANC, the ZANU-PF, must be able to say, is this what we fought for when thousands and thousands of our people are crossing the border? What is the next political or economic strategy that we must adopt for us to improve the circumstances of our people? We cannot allow this kind of exploitation. We can't allow this kind of pain. It will end up creating very difficult relations between our two states. If the people have no work in South Africa, they will say, it's the Zimbabweans. And the Zimbabweans will try and find a way of illegally staying in this country. Yet other regions, talk about the East African region, it doesn't matter where you work, but the stability within your environment is so critical. If a political party is not able to diagnose what is wrong in its system and discuss with one next door and listen to each other frankly in a closed door setup, we're going nowhere.
So when you were in government as President Mugabe's minister for all these years, was there any point where as cabinet or Mugabe himself ever thought that the relationship of South Africa and Zimbabwe was that of a horse and a rider?
No. No. I thought South Africa, the President Mugabe had extremely good relations with the President Zuma, President Mbeki. And I think these leaders were able to intervene when things were getting wrong, really wrong in Zimbabwe. They'll put their foot down. I mean, I can recall a meeting held in Livingstone where President Zuma did not take any prisoners and told President Mugabe that 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 things have gone wrong and let's fix this. And I thought that was done in a closed door session, but at the end of the day, we will all be there to witness at least a change or a positive direction emerging out of these very candid discussions. President Mbeki would not hesitate to fly to Harare. So the same with President Mandela, he would fly to Harare any minute. He felt that there's something wrong. He would give a call, Bob, are you in the office? I'm coming there. Oh, okay, that's fine. That, I think, is what we require, so that we do not allow things to continue like that. The GPA is a product of a region that felt that something had to be done in Zimbabwe. And clearly, whether one likes or not, and I spoke earlier on about the 5 hours, that there has to be reconciliation. We need to be able to work together as Zimbabweans. We can't win this discussion, this game around sanctions, for as long as we don't have a common platform. I don't care what somebody says. I believe come 2023, we must have a government that brings together various elements within our political circle who are able to sit down and say, guys, Zimbabwe must come first. From today, whatever we say in this room, whether we disagree in this room, but whatever solution we come up with, when we walk outside the room, let's have that message, a consistent message coming from one people. Yeah. That will help in the fight against sanctions. It will help in terms of our international relations. It will help in ensuring that Zimbabweans can have a sense of stability, and those are our children who are suffering beyond the borders will come back home.
Okay.
Because we've stabilized our situation.
Okay, I'm going to jump quickly to Brian because Brian has to leave. He's got a 6:30 engagement. Brian, there's been the issue of visas that were issued by President Zuma to Zimbabweans in 2010. And there's been an extension to June and another extension to December. We've got an election which is taking place in South Africa in 2024. What do you think is going to play out? What scenario do you think is going to play out in regards to these visas? Do you think they are going to be reissued, or there's going to be another extension again? Or politics will take place?
Let me say something that you have not asked and then answer what you have asked, Hopewell. As a Pan-Africanist who's been promoting freedom of movement and rights of residents across the region, I've often wondered how and why SADC has not moved fast on this. And also wondered why big South African business that Xavier Kasukwere says have taken advantage of the crisis in Zimbabwe, are operating, have bases in Zimbabwe, are not employing young black South Africans within their Zimbabwean operations. And you could say the same within their Congolese, Mozambican, and other operations. The problem we have, the psychosis of apartheid, created immobility for blacks, especially black professionals within South Africa, and created mobility for blacks from other parts of the region as an intention to dilute the activism that was growing within the organized and unionized South African black population. We have continued with that architecture, coloniality of labor relations within the region. If you ask me, South African businesses cannot take an emotive decision on those, nor can South African households. When you have people looking after your children, when you have people working in your business, you cannot within 6 months just simply wholesale, I'm going to fire them because the state says they are supposed to go back to their countries and I'm going to employ new people, because the cost of training new labor and maintaining the same service is fairly high. So in my view, Hopewell, there will be piecemeal renewals because neither Zimbabwe nor South Africa can afford a wholesale termination. It can happen when people want to be populist, but the consequences will be dire economically and socially. But I think that people need to think without boxes and ask the larger question that says, the hostility we are seeing is linked to two factors. One, something that Xavier has said about who do we train, how do we train, where do we train them. But the second is related to how do we partner with the private sector so that we create employment for those who feel their jobs are being invaded by others coming from other regions, not only within South Africa, but beyond South Africa. How do we pan-Africanize the South African solution to the South African labor question? And how do we stop whereby South African business deals with Zimbabwean economy in the same extractive way as the colonial economies did with the Zimbabwean economies? How do we establish within Zimbabwe such conditions and institutions and production sites and centers that enable the Zimbabweans to stay in their countries? Of course, politics is key, but I think that there are fundamental things we could do, working remotely, using technology. There are many things that could be done to offer opportunities, to deal with opportunities. I'm more concerned by what is not being done to create jobs for young black South Africans, because ultimately that's the determinant, not the policy, of how the question of Southern Africa's labor, migration and labor will be resolved.
Now, let me come in here, Hopewell, sorry, just a quick one to Brian. Many South Africans are of the view that Zimbabweans have got different set of aspirations compared to the political elites of Zimbabwe. And on the basis of that, they wonder what the politics of Zimbabwe is all about. I mean, if If people expect one thing from their elites, but they get the other, what are they to do? What else can they do about this? That's one part of the question. The second part of the question is, many ordinary South Africans, again, think that it's not their business to do much in and for Zimbabwe, but it is for Zimbabweans to do something for themselves. I'll cite an example. The broadcast of the Gold Mafia series on Al Jazeera, many South Africans had a lot to say and thought that somehow it will get people to be worked up and to demand certain answers from their political leadership, and they did not see that happening. Am I missing something?
Okay, you are not, but let me ask you a question before I answer your question. Let's assume 500,000 Zimbabweans or 1 million had gone on the streets, demanded something, and you had a military response, as would have been predictable, because fingered in the gold mafia was a military. Would this have necessarily resolved the Zimbabwean question or the South African question? I think, should there have been more done? Yes. Should Zimbabweans have spoken more about this, taken action about the held their leaders more accountable? Yes. But let's not mistake that manifestation as a solution to a deeply structural crisis that both the South African and the Zimbabwean economy face. Let me be very candid with you, Tim, and my South African brothers and sisters. South Africa does not have the bandwidth in its current policy mix and in its current governance trajectory to create, if you like, enough jobs, even if it had 50 years. Even if every Zimbabwean left, there would still not be enough jobs for South Africans. The rate of growth of your population, the mismatch between the literacy and numeracy rates and the jobs that your market, as highly sophisticated as it is creating, the sort of technical skills that you require to be globally competitive, and the sort of new competition that you face from friends and foes, including friends in the BRICS and those who are thinking and acting to constrain you. So it seems to me, Tim, we're tied together at the hip. I still hear South African brothers and sisters thinking that they are solving a Zimbabwean problem. And maybe in part. But if South Africans sat and did nothing, which is fair, because it's not their problem, they would still have a fantastically bad day at the court over the next 5 years. Why? A Zimbabwe that's resurgent, a Zimbabwe that is prosperous, a Zimbabwe that is stable, is not necessarily good for South Africa in the way that people think. Unless you create a secular economy of mutual benefit. And that's why I have been suggesting, Tim, the fundamental questions we must ask. It's clear looking at the last 100 years in South Africa that the South African economy is not capable of absorbing the number of high school and university graduates that you are now producing currently. So if your economy, your industries, your service sector and government is incapable of absorbing the people that you are producing in the schools, never mind the question that Xavier is raising about whether it's technicons or other classes, what will happen to these people? Your basic income grant is unable to accommodate them. So South Africa faces a splendid challenge. Mugabe's response was to give land to try and decongest the expectation of citizens, the expectations on government creating jobs and the small private sector creating jobs. His idea was go back to the land and become productive. His idea was indigenization, whether or not the policy was as good as it ought to have been or should have been and could have been. But that was Mugabe's solution. That solution is almost nearly impossible in South Africa because you are largely an urban populace, right? You are not, South Africa has got very few people within its rural areas. So in a sense, the true set of peoples and movements, labor unions, popular movements, rural movements, movements of the unemployed youth, should be talking at each other and talking with each other, I think, with greater nuance. And I suspect that right now we have the Zimbabwe nuisance factor, and one understands it as a Zimbabwean. This is South Africa's, this is country, South Africans feel it's their country, they're being crowded. But as one who also mocked Zambians as they flocked across the border to come and buy Coca-Cola and such things in the late 80s and did not take heed of what lessons Zambia was teaching Zimbabwe, I would say to my South African brothers, sisters, and cousins, Zimbabwe is a signpost for you. Zimbabwe is a signpost for you to understand your society better and its limitations, the limitations of your economic policy, the limitations of your governance structure, and also the limitations of the analysis that sees black migrant labor, especially from Zimbabwe, as the problem. You have not paid attention to other nationalities of a different that have come here, occupied more strategic components of the economy.
Thank you so much, Brian. I think that is a very important point. Tim, that Brian has made when he took us back to our relationship and how we understood things as they were unfolding in Zambia. 2 months ago, I had a conversation with President Samora Machel's son. And he actually broke down and started crying when he was telling me how he was insulted at St. George's as a foreigner, as someone who should go back. And this was the son of a sitting president who was being abused like this in Zimbabwe. So I hope that what Brian has said sticks in the minds of all Africans, that at some point, if you don't learn from what is happening with your neighbors, it might visit you. I know, Brian, that you have to leave. I just want to ask you one last question. You have often spoken about the failure by Zimbabweans to harness their intelligence. You've spoken about how Zimbabweans as individuals, they are extremely talented and exceptional when they go to the outside world. What is the problem in your view? Why is it Zimbabweans fail to harness that intelligence, bring it together to fix their own country and even to confront the dictatorship in Harare?
It's toxic brilliance, Hopewell. I think that we function on the misnomer, and this is an illness born in us by authoritarian or dictatorial rule. That for us to be able to do anything together, we must agree on everything. This idea of a people that want to operate in absolutes, absolute ideological alignment, absolute agreement on everything, and if we have any slight difference, it's corrected either through violence or suppression. Therein lies the problem. Everyone, therefore, thinks they have a better solution, a more perfect solution. No one is willing to support the other. So we have, through the so-called false brilliance, killed the seeds of solidarity. Solidarity requires a measure of humility that says the idea propounded by my brother or my sister may not be perfect, but it is the basis upon which we can build to find a solution that's mutually inclusive. So Zimbabweans want a perfect solution to everything. They want a perfect leadership. They want a perfect, and the reason why we have gross imperfections is because it is idealism that's gone rogue. But it's also the arrogance of thinking if something is not perfect, it is not functional. Zimbabweans could easily deal with the challenges we face, but we are so super and hyper affected by the idea that if we disagree, we must never talk to each other. If we disagree, we must never be seen it. And South Africa has a similar disease because we come from the same ideological, if you like, binaries, where you are either purely left or you are essentially right, or you are acceptably center. And so what's happened is people use the ideological framing, not ideological commitment. There is a difference. The most rabid capitalists use left-wing ideology to exclude other would be primitive accumulators. Zimbabwe's problem is not one of mediocrity, Hopewell. Zimbabwe's problem is not one of fear. Zimbabwe's problem is not one of scarcity. Zimbabwe's problem is one of excess. Excessively brilliant people, excessive ideas, excessive critique, excessive. What we need to go back to is to learn to operate on a low budget, live within our political means. This is the sort of challenge that we are facing. I cannot run anything by entirely excluding people who remotely disagree with me, let's say 40%. So we have to always navigate and work around not differences, but the minimum areas of alignment and agreement, so that we find in that minimum program of action things we can do together, as opposed to measuring on minus on things that we cannot do together. I expect that a person, I should be able, and I happily do talk to ZANU-PF people, I talk to Triple C people, I talk to MDC people. This is not like the biblical case of lepers, that once you join a party I disagree with, or I join a party you disagree with, we cannot talk. You know, a country that has constructed patriotism based on enmity, based on vilification, based on revenge and retribution, cannot build a truly patriotic citizenry that sees love for nation as first, as opposed to love for things that will pass away or die, like political parties, soccer teams, and etc.
So, Brian, before you go away and Hopewell, I would also like to hear your comment here. I would like us to come to the end of this Twitter space, but starting with you, Hopewell, what do you expect to happen come August, come the elections that are being prepared for at this time? What should we expect, not only as Zimbabweans, but the world, the South Africans? What do you think is likely to happen? And is there anything that can be done at this time to improve the situation ahead of the holding of the elections?
Thank you, Brother Tim. I think what needs to happen is a situation where the government and ZANU-PF play by the book. The rules and regulations are clear. Brian is a lawyer. He can tell you that just like South Africa, I think we have one of the most progressive constitutions, but we have a constitution that is never adhered to by the government. When the president or the ruling elites in ZANU-PF quote the constitution, is when it's convenient for them. Right now, tomorrow it will be 1 year for Job Scala in prison, a member of parliament, a lawyer by profession who was arrested doing his work as a lawyer. Bail is an entitlement according to our constitution, but he has been denied bail. We have so many people that have been arrested, thrown into prison unnecessarily. We have people that have had to run away. Xavier Kasukwere was in ZANU-PF, he's had to run away. He's now in South Africa and is plotting his comeback. But in an ordinary society, which is normal, as Brian said, we should not define our patriotism on the basis of how much I hate you or how much you don't like my views. We can do much better as Zimbabweans, as Africans. But the bad news I have for you, Tim, is that the election is going to be rigged. The election has been rigged already. The election is not going to be free and fair. The election is not going to provide an outcome that projects the views of Zimbabwean people. We do not have a voters' roll as we speak. Our constitution allows not just political parties or competitors to get the voters' roll. It allows even myself to walk into the Zimbabwe Electoral Commission with my $5 and get an auditable voters' roll. We don't have that now. We have a situation where there's state party conflation between ZANU-PF and the government. We have members of the Secret Service who are working for the ruling party in its election campaigns. So it's going to be impossible to have a free and fair election. The opposition could have done more, but the opposition could win an election even without campaigning if it was remotely free and fair, but it is not. And this is bad news for South Africa, because a lot of Zimbabweans are going to come after this election, maybe including myself, because we are fed up and we're saying, this can't carry on like this. SADC is a regional body, has been endorsing flawed elections in Zimbabwe, and we know that they will continue endorsing flawed elections in Zimbabwe. And because of that, it's going to be so difficult, not just for Zimbabwe and Zimbabweans, but for the region, particularly South Africa, because you have to carry this burden. Your big business is making a lot of money out of this crisis because they have got people that they can underpay. And this is what is creating problems. I like the fact that, Brian has been consistent with his views on Pan-Africanism. And in order for Pan-Africanism to be a reality in our lifetime, we have to build economies that work across the continent. Then it ceases to be an issue for a Cameroonian to come to Zimbabwe and work there because the economies are working. But at the moment, they are not. And I do not understand why the South African government is not worried about what's happening in Zimbabwe. Maybe they are, but they are not showing the agents of a government or a neighbor that is worried about what's happening. Because there's going to be so much social chaos in South Africa as Zimbabweans go. Again, I come back to what Brian said, that no amount of guns or police or fences will stop people if they have to go somewhere. And that's what's going to happen. So unfortunately, as we speak today on this Twitter space, we are not in a good political space that can deliver a remotely free and fair election in Zimbabwe. And because of that, there's going to be chaos in the region. It's not just about South Africa. It's also about Botswana. Zimbabweans can go to Zambia. In Mashonaland West, people are now going to Zambia for treatment. In Matabeleland, in Beitbridge, people go to South Africa. Zimbabweans are going where they can get medical treatment. In Plumtree, they go to Botswana. And the things that need to be done, team, to fix these issues, I've done the mathematics. To run Zimbabwean central hospitals professionally and to make sure that there is everything that is needed, you only need $50 million every year for 5 of the central hospitals to run properly. And the president has just given $20 million to the judiciary judges for obvious reasons. And so these are the things that Xavier was talking about, that at least at some point they could tell each other in closed doors to say, this is wrong. I don't know whether it's happening. And I also think that the South African media is not giving space to the Zimbabwean story in a way that makes the South African understand that it's no longer a foreign policy. Zimbabwe is now a domestic policy in South Africa.